Okay guys, today I'm going to go over cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is basically a genetic disease. It's not basically, it is a genetic disease. And what it causes is ineffective or impaired chloride ion channels in cells that secrete mucus. Specifically, it's called the CFTR gene, the cystic fibrosis transmembrane conductance regulator. And basically what it does is it regulates how much chloride leaves a goblet mucus producing cell. So let's get into it a little bit. First of all, any cells that secrete mucus are going to be affected by cystic fibrosis. So as we know, our respiratory tract secretes mucus, our GI tract, and our reproductive tract. Also, sweat glands are going to be affected, and that's how cystic fibrosis is actually diagnosed. I'll cover that a little bit later, but it's referred to as the sweat test. Now, anytime mucus becomes thick, it's difficult to move. And one of the functions of mucus is, in the respiratory tract, is to collect the bad stuff that we breathe in, and then the cilia will beat it from the lower airway to the upper airway. Well, if that mucus is really thick, then the cilia get overwhelmed and they can't move the mucus, and the mucus begins to build up in the lungs. The result is that you can't exchange gas. So they will become hypoxic and their CO2 levels go up and they go into respiratory distress. The most common cause of death with people with cystic fibrosis is respiratory failure. So let me just kind of show you a couple of background things in order for you to understand it. First of all, there's a law called the law of electroneutrality. And the law of electroneutrality states that in body fluid, regardless of where it is, there has to be an equal number of positively charged particles compared to negatively charged particles, so that the overall electrical charge inside that compartment, whether it be in the blood or the cell, it has to be neutral. So in this case, and in normal physiology, this is how it works. So we're looking at a goblet cell here, and then we're looking at two ion channels, chloride ion channel and a sodium ion channel. So when a goblet cell secretes mucus through the process of exocytosis, it enters the lumen of the respiratory tract, and it's going to have cilia on it. So basically, what the mucus does is it rides on that cilia, and then the job of the mucus is to collect that stuff, and then the cilia will beat it from the lower airway to the upper airway so you can get rid of it. Now, in normal physiology, what's happening is this. When the goblet cell secretes mucus, chloride will leave through a chloride ion channel and will enter the mucus. Now, that's negatively charged. So to maintain that law of electroneutrality, a sodium ion's got to follow it too, because sodium's positive. And as we all know, water is going to follow sodium through osmosis. So anytime you add water to something, you're going to thin it out. So this is how, in normal physiology, we make mucus that is movable and it does its job. Now, in people with cystic fibrosis, what's their problem? Their problem is jacked up chloride ion channels. So remember that the mucus that is initially produced by the goblet cell is relatively thick. Now, normally chloride leaves through the chloride ion channel, but in people with CF, they don't have it. And if chloride doesn't leave, then sodium doesn't have to follow. And if sodium doesn't follow, then you don't add water to it. The result is thick mucus. And again, mucus is good and bad. It's protective, but if there's too much of it, it starts building up in the lungs, blocking the airways. Also, bacteria love mucus. So people with cystic fibrosis end up with repeated and chronic respiratory infection, pneumonias, atelectasis, where their alveoli collapse. So they run into some really big problems. And this is probably the biggest concern related to cystic fibrosis, because you got to breathe. Now, there's some other problems associated with it too. One is in your GI tract. And this affects the entire GI tract, but more importantly, the pancreas, and I'll explain why. The pancreas, not only does it release insulin and glucose, but it's also insulin and glucagon. It's also involved in digestion, so it releases digestive enzymes. And those digestive enzymes that it releases are pancreatic lipase, which digests fat, pancreatic amylase, which digests carbs, and trypsin and chymotrypsin, which digest protein. So all of these enzymes are typically released from these acinar cells. Then they go into the pancreatic duct and they're washed into the duodenum by sodium bicarbonate. So bicarbonate's released to neutralize that acidic chyme in the duodenum from the stomach, and then the bicarbonate, to maintain that law of electroneutrality, sodium will follow it and water will follow the sodium, and that's what produces the pancreatic juice. Now this pancreatic duct produces mucus. So what's the problem? The mucus is really thick. So these cells that release the digestive enzymes, normally those enzymes get washed into the duodenum through the secretion of sodium bicarbonate and then water. But because that mucus is thick, those enzymes stay in the pancreatic duct because of the thick mucus. So now you got this thick mucus, and then you have lipase, amylase, and trypsin not going into the duodenum where you need them to go. Now, lipase digests fat, amylase digests carbs, and trypsin digests protein. And you're not going to believe this. So I'm going to say it real slow. Pancreatic cells are made of carbs, fats, and protein. So what will happen over time is these digestive enzymes, instead of digesting your McDouble, it will end up digesting your pancreatic cells. And that will get replaced by scar tissue, and it will form cysts, and that's how cystic fibrosis was first discovered. It wasn't necessarily discovered in the respiratory tract, even though these people had respiratory problems, but it was identified in the pancreas because of the repeated pancreatic damage, and it was replaced with scar tissue. So one of the things that people with pancreatitis have to do is they have to take digestive enzymes. So they have to take pancreatic lipase, amylase, and trypsin, and it's called PERT. Pancreatic enzyme replacement therapy. And by taking these enzymes, amylase, lipase, trypsin, you can digest the food, and they're enteric coated because we know enzymes are proteins and the stomach digests proteins. So they put a special coat on it that will not allow the hydrochloric acid in the stomach to work through it. And then when it ends up in the duodenum, that outer coating will break down and then release the digestive enzymes. And these digestive enzymes have kind of a feedback on the pancreas. So you already got digestive enzymes in there, and that will kind of shut down the pancreas from releasing any more digestive enzymes. And that's a good thing. You're going to be able to digest your food, and you're not going to get those enzymes stuck in the pancreatic duct, which will damage your pancreas. So how do you diagnose cystic fibrosis? Well, it's usually diagnosed in kids under the age of 3. And they will have chronic respiratory infections. They'll have problems with GI, right? They'll become constipated, or their belly will get bloated because of the damage to the pancreas. And how they do it is it's called a sweat test. So basically what they do is they usually take the inside part of the forearm and they place a drug on the skin called Pilocarpine. Now, pilocarpine blocks the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, if you recall, we've got 2 divisions to the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic, parasympathetic, and they both work together. So you always have some sympathetic and you always have some parasympathetic. So if you give them a drug that blocks the parasympathetic nervous system, and just locally on the skin of the forearm, basically what will happen is that all you have is the sympathetic nervous system working there locally. And as we know, the sympathetic nervous system produces sweating. Now, they place the electrode on there to kind of drive that medicine into the skin to stimulate sweat glands to sweat. Now, if we look here, all right, kind of get a little ahead of myself. So this is the surface of the skin. As it says, surface of the skin. And you get little blood in the dermal layer, right? And then you have the sweat gland, and then this is the sweat duct, right? Now, in normal physiology, what's happening is when a person begins to sweat, sodium, chloride, water, along with some other stuff, that's going to leave the sweat gland and go through the sweat duct and get on the surface of the skin. Now, the body does stuff that makes sense. So if you sweat enough, what's going to happen is that you're going to lose a ton of sodium and chloride, and of course that's bad for you, right? So the body does stuff that makes sense. So as that salt is traveling through the sweat duct, some of it will get reabsorbed back into the blood. So chloride gets reabsorbed back in the blood, and then to maintain that law of electroneutrality, sodium will get reabsorbed back into the blood, along with a little bit of water. But the most of the sweat, water, ends up on the surface of the skin. Now, in people who have cystic fibrosis, again, they have these impaired chloride channels. So when they administer the pilocarpine, they're going to begin to sweat. So the sodium and chloride and water is going to leave the sweat gland and go through the sweat duct. And normally the chloride gets reabsorbed, but in cystic fibrosis, it can't, right? So if the chloride doesn't get reabsorbed, the sodium doesn't get reabsorbed, and the water doesn't get reabsorbed. So eventually what happens is that the amount of sodium and chloride on the surface of the skin is elevated. So what they'll do is they'll measure the sweat, they'll put a little gauze on the arm, sop up the water and the sweat, and then have it chemically analyzed by a machine. And if the amount of chloride is greater than 60 millimoles per liter, then that's diagnostic criteria for cystic fibrosis. So the sweat test, along with other clinical presentation, right? They're going to be respiratory infections, short of breath. Also, they may come in malnourished, and we know why they will be coming malnourished, right? They'll also complain of abdominal pain because the mucus secreting cells of the large intestines, it makes real thick mucus, not a lot of water, so the poop gets real hard, and they can end up with what's called a telescoping bowel, where the bowel just kind of starts folding in on itself, and that can be bad for you. You don't want a telescoping bowel, right? You should write that down. So that's just a little bit on the pathophysiology of cystic fibrosis. But probably the most important thing to keep in mind is that wherever you have cells that produce mucus, so respiratory system, GI tract, reproductive system, you're going to have problems when you have cystic fibrosis. So in men, due to that genetic mutation, they don't have a vas deferens. And as we learned, the vas deferens is the tube that takes the sperm from the testes into the ejaculatory duct. So if you don't have any way of transporting the sperm to the ejaculatory duct, you can't get anybody pregnant. And that's why in males, they're usually sterile, or not sterile, but infertile. They produce the sperm, they just can't get it to where it needs to go. So I hope that helped.